Many people know that experience. Waking up as a child in a bed that seems totally foreign. Now, you fall asleep watching your favorite movie or playing your favorite video game and inevitably end up in a land unlike the one you fell asleep in. Now, although your parents inevitably moved you in the middle of the night, you don't know this and you wake up confused. I myself still wake up sometimes, not remembering where I fell asleep, and have that tinge of confusion. Where am I? Who am I? What am I doing here? Now, although these are some childish fantasies or funny events that we discuss with our friends a day after, what ultimately happens as a fantasy for us can be a crushing reality for others. And that brings me to the disease that I want to talk about today, which is dissociative fugue. Now, the American Psychological Association has characterized fugue as one or more episodes of amnesia in which there is an inability to recall one's past or a loss of one's identity. Generally, when fugue occurs, there's a purposeful exodus to some foreign place that is far away from their actual home. Now, what does this look like? Many don't actually know what this looks like because they've never heard of it, and it isn't widely covered in literature or the media. Therefore, I offer a good example of Agatha Christie, a woman living in England. One day, she left her house, her clothes completely in her drawers, no dishes moved, her car found on the side of the road, and everyone thought she had been murdered in some way, shape, or form. She had left no traces of where she had gone. They searched and they searched for weeks and even months. However, 3 months later, she turned up at a country club. She was sitting there, and her brother walked in and she said, "That's my brother, Aggie." Now, what was interesting about this story is that she came back from this episode of Fugue, and she actually realized that she was in a foreign place. However, while she was under this Fugue episode, this episode of amnesia, she believed that her name was Teresa Neal, and she went by that for over 3 months as this totally different person. Now, that's what Fugue is like, and this was one of the best documented cases of Fugue because they found her and talked to her about it years later. However, we don't really hear about this because this dissociative disease affects only 0.2% of the population of the world. Now, this is primarily women and primarily, almost certainly, people that have had some traumatic or stressful event in their life. They've seen some stress and therefore they become depressed and feel a need to get away from it. Now, the symptoms of this dissociative disease include like a sudden disturbance. You are away and unable to recall the past. The biggest symptoms that you can see are people that are distressed or they're socially impaired. Now, this becomes huge when you're looking at people that do end up having dissociative fugue. What happens is that they get stressed by an event or they have poor social skills because they are pretty depressed. Now, what happens is then they have this sudden disturbance and they're away, unable to recall the past, and they have this event of amnesia. Some people that describe people that they've seen in fugue, they describe them with their eyes glossed over, a confused look when spoken to about the past. However, this is not driven by substance or driven by any general medical condition. So these symptoms arise on their own and generally are out of a type of trauma. Now, this brings me to what predisposes you to the disease, and the things are fairly easy. Now, fugue isn't generally a very genetic disease. It's actually an environmental disease that depends on the conditions in which you live, rather than your heredity. However, people can be predisposed to this disease for a litany of reasons. The first is that you have a family history of people with amnesia or severe depression. Now, this can in turn impact you and allow you to be more open to some of these amnesia events like dissociative fugue. However, the biggest people that are predisposed to this issue are people that are experiencing extreme trauma. Now, this can be a Great World War or a death of a loved one. Whatever it is, trauma has to occur for dissociative fugue to take hold of an individual. Generally, this trauma creates seriously anxious or severely depressed peoples. Now, all these statistics on how you are predisposed come from the Suicide and Psychiatric Disorders, written by Robert Teratelli. Now, what we see here is that there needs to be a traumatic event, and in Agatha Christie's example, what we saw was that both her father and one of her other brothers, the one that wasn't Aggie that found her, died within 2 months of each other. Now, this extreme stress and this extreme trauma on her life in turn caused her to have this dissociative event, which begs the question, what is dissociative fugue mainly? Now, psychologists are still debating. However, the biggest agreement is that dissociative fugue is actually a type of defense mechanism outlined by Sigmund Freud. Now, although this is not included as one of his key defense mechanisms, what we ultimately see is that it's commonly used as one, and it's agreed in the scientific community that it is used as a defense mechanism. People have stress in their lives, they have stress in their home states, they have stress as the person they are, and so their brain simply can't handle it anymore, and they go off on some purposeful exodus, and their brain forces them to lose memory of their previous life because it's too stressful on their psyche in order to continue. Now we see that this is actually a very interesting uh, defense mechanism, simply because it forces the individual to completely forget about their past, which also shows the power of the mind when in stressful, traumatic situations, but the power of the mind in general to ultimately control the person that you are. When the mind becomes too stressed, they completely erase the person that that person was. They don't have any memory of it, and they completely become someone new, like Theresa Neal, who is living in some foreign country and you don't even notice. Now, this is extremely impactful for the world of psychology and the world as a whole, understanding the brain. Now, the treatment, therefore, becomes a little bit more difficult. Now, the treatment is so difficult simply because these are single cases, and usually there's no recurrent of these events. This all come from the Psychological Encyclopedia by John Kenneth. And what happens is the subjects don't remember anything that went on during that episode of Fugue. It's a bit like an exchange. They move from one life to the other, forgetting their entire previous life, and then move back to that previous life, forgetting that entire episode in between. This means that there's these single episodes, and therefore there's no way to really treat this other than to get at it preemptively. Now, the first thing that is outlined by the Psychological Encyclopedia is you need to come to terms with the trauma. Now, what that means is coming to terms with some of these events that ultimately cause depression and extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, which can drive someone to dissociative fugue. Now, cognitive therapy has been seen to work best because they change the thought process of the individuals about this traumatic, stressful event. Rather than thinking that they're worthless from this event, that this event will destroy them, they're changed to think about this event as something positive. The death of a loved one as a reason to keep going. A world war as a reason to keep trying harder each and every day. Now, what that means is that you bring forth some of these bad traumatic stress disorders and you attack them head on. Now, cognitive therapy has been known to work best. However, that's not the only treatment that can be used. Coping mechanisms under the psychoanalytic perspective are also a great way to do this. By finding coping mechanisms that aren't simply fleeing from your problems. Maybe using these problems to write about, writing some poetry, making music, doing anything like this, and allowing yourself to cope in different ways other than running from these problems and becoming extremely stressed out is the best way to have people who are at risk for dissociative fugue to prevent an attack like that. Now, the final thing that the psychoanalytic perspective defines as treatment is actually hypnosis. And hypnosis is a great way to bring trauma forward if people don't understand why they're feeling depressed or why they're feeling anxious and they know it's over a traumatic event. Many people don't like to talk about traumatic events. In one case, a woman did not want to talk about her sexual assault as a child. Now, with the use of hypnosis, this came out and she was able to start coping with it, understanding it, and ultimately turning this traumatic memory into one that drives her today. She was an extremely at-risk candidate for dissociative fugue. However, by using some of these treatment options, she was able to avoid that, and also by using medication along with some of these therapy treatments, you can get rid of your depression, your anxiety, and your amnesia completely. However, like we said, if you are depressed or anxious or have had a traumatic event, you are predisposed to this disorder. It just depends on how your brain handles it. So at the end of the day, what we can see is that dissociative fugue could ultimately be defined as a defense mechanism. However, it is an extreme disorder. You lose all sense of yourself from before and live sometimes for years as a completely different person. Now, the impacts that this can have on people's livelihoods is immense, and so what we need to start understanding is that even some of these smaller diseases, only affecting not even 0.5% of our world, need to be dealt with and need to be discussed because they're extremely impactful to the individuals that they have taken a toll on. So what we ultimately see from dissociative fugue is that there are treatment options. There's a way to treat it before it gets bad, and people with extreme traumatic events that don't deal with them very well should actually seek help, should seek some treatment because they are extremely predisposed to that. Additionally, if you start seeing some of the symptoms like sudden disturbances in your memory, an inability to recall past events, or you get confused about people talking to you, all of those are signs that you may be at risk for dissociative fugue, and it may help you to go to a therapist. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we see is that a fantasy for some of us, waking up in a foreign bed, feeling like we're a totally different person, or wishing we could restart our life in a foreign country with new friends, new mentors, and new everything. That is a childish fantasy for many of us, and for some of us, this is a reality that they cannot escape from. They lose years and years of their lives and can take huge impacts. So the next time you wake up in your bed feeling confused and not knowing where you are, think a little bit about having that feeling for years on end and not being able to know who your family members are. It doesn't just take a toll on the individual, but takes a toll on the community as a whole, and sometimes all the people are affected by the disappearance of a loved one to a foreign land, only to return a month later, just like Agatha Christie. Thank you for listening to my speech today. I encourage you to look up more about dissociative fugue and learn more about the impacts and implications that we can have by studying such a powerful mental disease. Thank you.